This is a off-the-cuff video. Doing some shopping today and got some bad news, well, at least for those of us in Jacksonville. When I was in seminary, I was told, my freshman year, I was told that a pastor, if he's doing it right, is going to at least have a church of 200 to 300 people. That success as a pastor was determined by how large your congregation was. A friend of mine who was a pastor of a small church out in St. Augustine was told by another pastor involved in my seminary that God wasn't blessing him as much because, well, his church was much smaller compared to this other pastor. He was a pastor of a megachurch. God's blessing was measured in butts in the seats. That leads me to my point of this video. Went shopping and to update my wardrobe. I'm not the biggest fashion guy in the world to begin with. I'm just clueless in that area. But after shopping, me and my friend went to Chick-fil-A. And I happened to grab the Metro section because on the top it was a story about homosexuality. So I grabbed it, planning to read that story while I was eating. But down in the corner on the front page, someone who'd made a big impact upon me had died. His name was George Harvey. You probably have no idea who he is, even if you live in Jacksonville. You could live in Jacksonville for, lived here my whole life. Truth is, most people probably haven't heard of him. And certainly most Christians, as a matter of fact, most more secular people have probably heard of Harvey rather than Christians, which is sad in a lot of ways. You see, Pastor Harvey preached at a church on Laura Street. He died in his 50s of a heart attack while discipling someone. Ever since God had saved him, he became a pastor, I believe in the 70s, and had been faithfully preaching the gospel ever since. 6 nights a week he preached at his church because that's what God called him to do. Sometimes the only people that were there were his wife and his kids. And some inmates that he had preached the gospel to and that he had mentored because he went to the prison so many times. Very rarely did his church, even on a Sunday, ever get above 30. Despite being in a well-populated area, although in a bad part of town. It was more gang-riddled, more violent part of town. Because that's where he wanted to preach. Where he thought the gospel was needed most. So he preached 6 nights a week. Faithfully. Because he wanted the doors open, and he wanted the gospel to be preached. And he wanted all the people around him to know. But they could always hear the gospel if they needed to hear it. But according to my seminary, Pastor Harvey was a failure. Because all he could get was 20 or 30 people, and all he could get was maybe 6 people. Maybe he didn't even get anybody to come. The nights I attended, it was his family. A man from the prison, and me and my friend, about 6 of us that night. Been there a few times there on Laura Street. Modern Christianity deems Pastor Harvey a failure because he never had a big church, because he wasn't a success by their standards. But why? remember hearing Paul Washer, and it's an interesting question. There are stars out there no one will ever see. Why did God create them? We'll never see them because He enjoys them, and they exist for Him. You're going to have to forgive me here. Barely holding it together. Pastor Harvey, nobody knew who he was, but God did. God knew who Pastor Harvey was, and much like that star that no one will ever see, but existed for God and purely for God's enjoyment, so did Pastor Harvey. And I find it interesting, though. I've seen a lot of megachurches in this town. They may have 5,000 or 6,000 members. And none of them have ever matched what Harvey did in the inner cities. Pastor Harvey did in prisons. I've met the inmates he mentored and he discipled. Hardened criminals, many of them. The guy I met, the couple that I met at his church, were hardened criminals. Pastor Harvey mentored them, was faithful, preaching the gospel. And these men dramatically changed, an entirely new person created by God. The paper didn't really mention that this morning. What determines success? I knew with the Dana Muldoon thing. She preaches materialism. But nothing of lasting value. Pastor Harvey dedicated his life to the inner city, to preaching the gospel, always going to the prisons. It was something he regularly did, making sure his church there on Laura Street was always open, preaching the gospel. He was faithful to the Lord, a faithful husband and a faithful father. But he was a man that no one will ever know existed, for the most part. Yet he was one of the most godly men I knew, one of the most amazing preachers. He's one of those people, and there aren't a lot of those people around. But he's one of those people, when you were around him, you knew full well this was a man who walked with God, who knew God intimately, and God certainly knew him. I think it's, in a way, kind of maybe God's judgment upon this city for taking him when he was really still young. You'll be missed, Pastor Harvey. But what is success? Success defined by God. There's a man who faithfully preached the gospel, and the truth is, nobody really knew it. Why did he exist? Because, frankly, like that star that no one's ever going to see, he existed for Christ. He existed for God. And he really did make a huge impact. Kind of like that basketball player who you look at the end of the game and he's got a big stat line. But you remember watching the game and thinking, I don't remember seeing him. Anyway, we'll miss you, Pastor Harvey. Take care.